Hello and welcome to Let the Bird Fly, a podcast about living freely in a world given back to us. This is Wade here in the podcast studio for the first of a couple episodes we're hopefully recording today around some bureaucracy, some meetings here at the college. And we are going to be talking today. This will probably be a shorter episode, but sometimes we say that and it reminds me of one of my favorite Luther sermons for the circumcision of our Lord, where he says this is on one verse, so it'll be a short text. And then he goes on for 13 pages. But this should be a short episode. And we've had a number of episodes lately that were tied to the church year. And I'm hoping that we can do that with this as well and talk a little bit about one of the minor festivals that are coming up, and that is the Festival of St. Barnabas. Barnabas is known for his work with St. Paul and then with John Mark. And I thought, well, this is coming up, and I just want to confirm the date here now, because I have in my head June 11th, but I want to make sure I have this right. Yeah, June 11th is when the Wells commemorate St. Barnabas, Apostle. And so we've talked about ordinary time. We're going into ordinary time now, and this is the long green season. But Michael mentioned in the previous episode that you can break that green up a little bit if you want, if you transfer some minor festivals to Sundays. And I thought, you know what, we haven't really talked much about minor festivals, and so it might be helpful to talk a little bit about that, and Barnabas would be a really neat one to talk about. And this is something, too, I sometimes do this at Resurrection Lutheran Church where I serve. You know where that is, Michael? That's on Howard Avenue, just off Howell.
What time is your services
9 a.m.
on
is the Divine Service. We celebrate the Divine Service every Sunday, 9 a.m. in the summer.
The full Mass?
Yeah, it's the full divine service, weekly communion, and we're gonna give you word, and if you're catechized, confirmed member of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod or Evangelical Lutheran Synod, you are invited to the supper. If not, talk to the pastor. You know who the pastor is, Michael?
Wade Johnston.
The pastor's me, and we can talk about making sure that you know the faith and what you're receiving. But Resurrection Lutheran Church, 9 a.m., rlcmilwaukee.org. We're on Howard Avenue, again, just off Howell. But sometimes when I have room on the church calendar, I will put the minor festivals on the church calendar. And something I need to get better at doing is in the news and notes to put the readings for those minor festivals. Because these can also be tools for people in their own devotional life at home for them to connect to the history of the church. And for many of the festivals you'll find in our hymnal, to men and women from the scriptures, and to learn a little bit more about them. And usually, for each person you're learning a little bit more about, you're learning a little bit more about certain Christian teaching or aspects of the Christian life. And that's what I think makes Barnabas a fun one. And so we'll be talking about that today. And in a moment, I'll have you, Michael, just talk a little bit again about what minor festivals are. But if you wouldn't mind, I'll play lightly in the background our music, if you could give us the disclaimer, Michael.
This show doesn't speak for our churches or church bodies or our employers. To be honest, much of the time it probably doesn't speak for us. We will be thinking out loud a lot, so approach what you hear with a healthy skepticism, because, well, as a responsible resident of planet Earth, that's probably what you should generally do with almost everything. If you find yourself getting too worked up, tune out, look around, and realize you were just listening to a podcast. That's right, a podcast. So go live free, friends, and don't let us get in the way.
And while the music plays, Michael, you know something we should be encouraging our listeners or viewers to do, and that is subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel yet, we are getting a lot of video content up there that goes with the audio. The audio is still in your favorite podcatchers, but we would really appreciate getting some of you subscribing to the YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed in your favorite podcatcher, you should, of course, do it there as well. And probably in your favorite podcatcher, give us a review. A really nice review is 5 stars. 5 stars really helps us out.
Throw a 4 in there once in a while.
Yeah, and then
so
Michael and I are going to watch the last episode. We had some technical difficulties in the middle, and that button on Mike's Rodecaster was blinking red. So we're going to watch that sporadically, try to catch it. I managed to take out is probably our best content. I took it out. So I streamlined it some. We only ended up with 30 seconds of dead air. But we will watch for that. And with that, we will make our way to the main topic, which is St. Barnabas Apostle, whose commemoration is June 11th. And first, Michael, why don't you just refresh our memory of what a minor festival is?
Okay, so think about the church here. You have Sundays like the Easter Sunday, the first Sunday of Easter, or the second Sunday, or the third Sunday after Pentecost. And so there's a little bit of the language there matters, right? So you have a Sunday after Pentecost or a Sunday after the Epiphany of our Lord. That's what we call ordinary time, often using that as green. But then there's a season of Easter, so there's Sundays in Easter. And if there's lots of different rules, we won't get into it, but if it's a Sunday of something, that takes precedent normally. But if it's a Sunday after something, well, then it's something that you could transfer something to, or you could, if a saint's day like St. Barnabas falls on that Sunday, then it's appropriate for you to celebrate that day, right? And so there's sort of there's a protocol there, right? Like if St. Mark's Day, which I believe is March 25th, something like that.
That's the Annunciation, isn't it? March 25th?
Yeah, maybe it's the Annunciation.
I'll look it up.
And there's another one in late March. I think it's St. Mark. Anyway, if that would fall on Easter Sunday, you of course are going to celebrate Easter Sunday. You're not going to supplant Easter Sunday, the most important day of the church year, with
April 25th. You were
April
just
25th. Okay, you're not gonna put it as something else. And of course, there's no like set rules here that you have to like get all worked up about. These are just protocols.
There are no New Testament ceremonial laws or whatever that is that we were supposed to say all the time.
But it's not wise to supplant Easter Sunday with something that you've made up, right? Or something that the church has on its calendar. So think about it. If you really want to be simple, if it's a green Sunday and something falls on that green Sunday or really close and you want to transfer it, that's certainly reasonable, right? So for instance, St. Michael and all angels in the latter half of September 28th, correct?
Oh, boy,
You look that up.
Work here.
September 28th.
September 29th.
29th.
You're only one day off. We're getting closer. 1 month off, 1 day off.
If that's like falls on a Monday, or any time during the week, and you want to make that a special Sunday, that's perfectly okay. You wouldn't do that, of course, if it was Lent 1 or if it was Christmas Day or Easter, right? So these saints' days or commemorations, or what we might call loosely minor festivals, right? They're minor for a reason compared to like a major festival, which would be Maundy, Thursday, Palm Sunday, Easter Sunday. Those can be used. If you really want to like make sure you don't lose this stuff, what is appropriate is, let's say it's the fifth Sunday of Easter, and that falls on April 25th, St. Mark Day. You could certainly mention St. Mark, and what is also a nice custom that we mentioned, I think in the last episode maybe, is that you have two prayers of the day. You have the prayer of the day for Easter 5, and also then you do St. Mark's, right? And so that's a way to just keep people attuned to the church calendar, which is very important because calendars form us, right? And we have holidays that go all over the place. We have holidays that are secular. We have holidays that are nationalistic, like July 4th, something like that. Nationalistic's not the right word, but a nation's holidays. And so we're not saying that you have to like, these are calendars that compete, but they do, right? And so if you can have multiple calendars, keeps people connected to the scriptures, the story of scriptures, and the formation of their spiritual lives, literally in time and space. It's helpful there. So a minor festival, again, it's fun to break up the long green seasons. It's also something that is fun to preach on because usually now it's a story, right? It's a story, and stories are the easiest and the most fun to preach, and I would imagine usually more fun to hear. Yeah. And in particular the Saints' Day. So there's other minor festivals that you'll have, like these are events in the life of Christ, like the Annunciation of Christ. Um, those are the circumcision of our Lord. Those make a lot of sense, right? And they do follow sort of like the chronological time. So on the 8th day he was circumcised, and so that would be December 31st. The Annunciation we mentioned is 9 months before Christmas Day, that kind of stuff. Those make sense to supplant, right, an ordinary Sunday, because we're literally talking about the story of Christ and salvation. But the Saints' Days are helpful too, because what you see sinners that are redeemed by Christ and used by Christ. And so the connection there, the application to our Christian life is very easy, right? Even though you're not going to probably have a conversion experience like St. Paul, you can still talk about St. Paul's conversion, which is in January 27th. January 27th.
Conversion of St. Paul is January 25th.
25th. Oh, I already messed up on the 25th. I was going to go with the 25th. Anyway, you can say, hey, it's the same Spirit, the same Word of God, the same Jesus that was active in your conversion, even if it wasn't as dramatic as Paul's, right? And so the Saints' Days, they get a little bit of a bad rap in the Protestant world because of the medieval and very, let's say, ancient spiritual custom of connecting yourself to the ancestors, to the people who have gone before. And so the medieval custom that is often seen in other denominations of praying to the saints, that makes us feel a little awkward, and rightfully so, right? You don't have to go through the saints. You can go straight to Jesus Christ. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. These are fun things. These help tell the biblical history, and often, especially the New Testament saints, these are stories that maybe you don't actually think about. Like in Sunday school, yeah, you get Noah, you get Abraham, you get Moses, you get these stories. And by the way, there are days in the church year for those Old Testament saints as well. But we sort of know Barnabas, we sort of know Titus, we sort of know these things, but they're not like the mainstay in like Sunday school and catechism. And so this is a good way to do that. But it also puts you into the New Testament churches, which is where we reside. I would go so far as to say it's helpful also to do commemorate saints that are not always biblical as well. And before we get all worked up,
By not biblical, you mean not in the
Post-biblical,
Bible,
yeah.
not that their theology wasn't.
yeah, so something after the end of Revelation, right? And before we get too worked up about that, well, we have Reformation Day. We remember
Presentation of the Augsburg Confession.
church anniversaries, that kind of stuff. So the Protestant world still does this, and I think it is helpful to think, for instance, the presentation of the Augsburg Confession, June 25th. I know that one's right.
That is correct.
But there's ones in our history as well, right? Like you can remember Ambrose. Or Augustine. Those are fun things to think about.
And Augustine, his brother.
Yeah, and even his twin brother, and even in the Lutheran Church to remember, like Lutheran Artist Day, April 6th, is a fun day to maybe you want to mention that. Now, April 6th is most likely going to fall into the Easter season, so good luck with that. But like there's a day for CFW Walther. There's a day for Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon. And maybe that doesn't rise to the time where you could celebrate that on a Sunday. I would caution against that, but something you could mention. It is something that you can do in your ministry, in a weekly ministry, whether it be like daily devotions that you send out or newsletter or something like that. History matters, right? And so this is my long way of saying history matters, and there's a biblical history that really happened in time and place, and God is being active even after the last verse of Revelation, and he's active in your life right now through sinners that he has made saints, and you're a sinner made saint, right? So history gives us that perspective. It gives us a calming comfort, because we see the church has been through a lot worse than what we're going through right now, right? So we're all worked up about this election or that election, and then you hear about Peter being crucified upside down. You're like,
St. Lawrence being grilled.
like it's those are good things for us to remember. Not that we emulate them, like that's the main purpose, but to see God's action in that. By the way, Luther had kind of a fun line. He said something along the lines of this, that you could never emulate the saints or even Jesus Christ. Not only is that not the purpose, right? Law versus gospel, but you live in a different time and place, right? There's no imitation of Christ, and the punchline of that is, you're not a cheap imitation of the saints or Christ. You're actually the real deal, Christ's righteousness in the world. And so when you put that all together, not only do you sort of give yourself permission to do these things and to think about these things, but you see a great pastoral value there. All right.
Yeah, and so history, it's been said, doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And so there are lessons we can learn without having to, and this is the great temptation, I think, for pastors and seminarians, especially when we're younger, as we find someone from church history that we really look up to, and we not only want to emulate what we admire about them, but we can almost see our lives through this. Flacius did this with Luther, right? Kind of sometimes maybe created situations.
And Wade Johnston did it with
Flacius. Sure, yeah. But the Lutheran confessions do say, so this is the Augsburg Confession, Article 21. Augsburg Confession is the foundational confession of the Lutheran Church. Article 21 is about the invocation of the saints or the worship of the saints. And they simply say there, our churches teach that the history of the saints may be set before us so that we may follow the example of their faith and good works according to our calling. And I think that's helpful. We see the content of the faith they believed, and we rejoice to proclaim that same content. But we also see the faith with which the Spirit gifted them, which led them often to serve in particularly important ways, sometimes ways that were very important, although ordinary, but still significant. And then we also can learn from their good works according to their calling. And I think this is helpful when we set them before our people. We're not saying, now you be Barnabas, who we'll talk about, but what can we take away from Brother Barnabas, who served in the situation in which he found himself? And so the Lutherans do early on revise the church year somewhat, as they did with the Mass. But this is a lot more conservative of a revision than most American Lutherans would expect. And still today, if you go to Germany, even Protestant areas of Germany, what we might call secular calendar or state calendar is still really shaped by these church days, these days of the church year. You'll often have certain areas that, though they were Protestant, still clung to someone from church history because this person played a role in their region, or the story of this person was particularly inspiring to them in some way, or they're named after this person, or their churches, or whatever the case may be.
There's civic pride often there.
Yeah. And so this is something that the Lutheran Church did maintain because it saw value in it. Like every good thing, any good thing can be abused. And so the Augsburg Confession will address, but we don't worship the saints. We don't the Roman Church will break this down into 3 categories to try to say they don't worship the saints or Mary, and you'll get latria and dulia and hyperdulia. It's kind of like what was a Supreme Court justice, I think it was asked, can you define pornography? And he said, no, but I know it when I see it. Sometimes you can see practices with the Saints or Mary, and you go, okay, yep, that's too far. I've never seen that in a Wells church or a Missouri Synod church. Now, maybe around Reformation Day, you get
Hmm.
kind of some weird, vibes. But even there, I'm reminded when I first went to MLC to tour it when I was still becoming Lutheran, but my pastor had encouraged me to go check it out, and the recruiter there, who went on to be a wonderful district president as well, had met me in Livonia, and then I went out and saw MLC, and my friend who is also now a pastor, he's a non-denominational pastor, which means Baptist, and he came with me to tour campus, and they had the bronze statue or whatever it's made out of Luther, and he said, I know it. I knew it. You guys pray to him, don't you? And I was still learning the faith. So I'm like, I don't think so, you know? But like if the Synod president had told me to at that point, maybe I would have thought about it, you know? And that they warn against worship, but that doesn't mean the church just throws out its history. And this was a important thing about the Lutheran Reformation over against the Reformed Reformation is the Reform saw this rupture in church history where there was like the apostles and then there was the Middle Ages and everything was just kind of lost. And now they were going back to the apostles. Lutherans saw the gospel always there, even if obscured, because the word and the sacrament had never completely gone away. And so Luther could draw on like a Saint Bernard, even as he rejects some things he might say. The Lutherans were able to go to the medieval fathers and find great value, even as there were times where they had to say, maybe not this. And this is something I think that American Lutheranism could recapture, um, valuing the work that God has done through the church throughout the ages, even in ages where maybe they weren't as right on church and ministry and fellowship as we would like, the 8th century or something, that there is value and comfort in knowing that God has worked through all these times. And so I would agree with you, Michael, about saints who come after the scriptures have been written as well, the value of this. Now, maybe if we make our way to Barnabas, and I thought this was a good one to do for this because we don't have to go overboard talking about Barnabas, but what I want to use is just Barnabas as a bit of a springboard to talk about what can we, as lay people or as pastors, gain from maybe just shaping our devotions that for that day, for June 11th, with the readings for Barnabas, or maybe transferring a minor festival and using it as a day for a pastor to explain. I think one of the values, as you said, is you get to tell stories, and not just stories that you're like finding from the news or that happen in the parsonage, but stories that the church has treasured because they've seen value in them. Stories, in many cases, that the church treasured so much that they made them into the canon. And Barnabas gives us a number of those stories. And also, there's a great hook with Barnabas. It's always nice to have a hook, right? And that's Barnabas' name. Barnabas came to be called son of encouragement. In Acts, he sells his property and he gives it to support the community. This is how we're introduced to him. He's a Cyprian, I believe. And he's given this name, son of encouragement. And so there's your hook, right? Because the name fits. And as we see him throughout the New Testament, through the Acts of the Apostles, and when Paul mentions him, Barnabas is just an encouraging guy, and not encouraging like platitudes, like some modern affirmation kind of vapid encouragement, but encouragement in the gospel, right? Wanting to encourage people as they grow in faith. And we'll see that in how he interacts with St. Paul and in how he interacts with John Mark specifically. So I thought, Michael, if it's okay, maybe we could hit on that a little bit, and then I could throw it to you, and maybe how would you bring this out to your people if you were transferring it? And then we can hit on a little bit, if you're the lady, what can you do if you want to observe this at home?
Okay, one other thing before you get going, just the importance of story. We talked about this before. Being a part, you need a story. You need a part of a story. But think about how doesn't matter what discipline it is or what area of your life. The stories are the ones that are the most memorable, the things you keep going back to, the things that pull out wisdom and meaning. So, for instance, you can memorize all the dates about the Continental Congress and this, that, and the other thing. But the story of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson actually probably gives you more insight into the beginning of the United States than just any of these facts, right?
Yep.
This is true of sports too. I was just got a reel on Dennis Rodman and the Bad Boys, right?
It was a
Now
beautiful time.
I remember I was living in LA, so
They
not
hated us then.
back home, yeah, and remember the Bad Boys in the late '80s, early '90s. But that story of Dennis Rodman, which is actually a fascinating story, right? Um, Gave me more insight into that time period rather than just looking back and go, oh yeah, the Pistons swept the Lakers. That was kind of the beginning of the end for the Lakers. They made a comeback, but then the Bulls, the Bulls had to overcome the Pistons. That those sort of facts that
Right.
we all know, but the stories really mattered,
Yeah.
right? And so
Because the
you keep
stories
going,
are formative.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you can keep going back, and there's nuances there that you can apply. It's not as easy to do that with just a box score if we're going
Yeah.
to continue that analogy.
And I think you make a great point there, Michael. And this is why it's really the Lutherans, especially and the Protestants, that introduced modern church history, where we're going to try to go back and critically establish with manuscripts and all these other things what actually happened as best as we can figure it out. Um, for much of church history, what you had was hagiography, which was these stories about men and women who, in some, again, extraordinary and yet sometimes extraordinary in just how ordinary it was way, um, were moved through faith to serve neighbor or to give their life or whatever the case may be. And I think this is, it's not all bad. The hagiography did lead to abuse and that did have worship of the saints, but it also did capture something about the human experience that these stories do sometimes help draw you into the communion of saints, make you feel a part of something, right? And that can be very important too, depending on where and when you're at church history. Maybe you're at a church, it's not the biggest church in the world. Maybe it's not as big as it used to be. Maybe you're at a small church in a geographic area that's not that connected. But this reminds you, you're connected to this thing that transcends time and space
The
and is
communion
filled with
of
stories
saints.
and with songs and with prayers. And I think that can be very helpful, and especially very helpful in a day where, for all our connectivity online, we're more disconnected perhaps
Yeah.
than ever before. For all of our wanting to belong, this sometimes the church forgets we actually belong to something much bigger than just our immediate congregation.
And what we mean here by these stories that you can go back to, and there's these nuances, you can tell them, then they're fresh every generation. We mean something different than like Aesop's fables, although you can keep going back to that, but there's usually a moral to the story. And so many of the stories that we hear from the pulpit are more in line with that. Like, here, I'm going to try to make this point, have one little line, and make a doctrinal teaching or emotional point here. No, we mean stories that have lasted over time.
Yep.
And there's nuance there and can be applied in many multiple ways to individuals.
And sometimes as Protestants, we can be too hard on the early and medieval church too, because we won't get to talk a lot about Barnabas because I'm gonna have to go to this meeting, but you get to the end of his life and he's martyred, and so Protestants will always emphasize allegedly martyred. Church tradition says the church didn't take these things lightly early on. There was great importance attached to martyrdom. They would commemorate the day of the martyrdom, often go to the site of the martyrdom for those anniversaries. So there's a healthy skepticism that Protestants can have about church history, but sometimes there's, like you said, these stories are not necessarily mythology, and there might be room where we can't say for certain, but there's still something to that story and why it stuck, and often what it expresses about the Christian faith or the Christian experience. So if we make our way to Barnabas, Barnabas, early on in Acts, sells his possessions, gives them for the support of the church. He's the son of encouragement. The reading that I would preach on if I were transferring this festival would be from Acts. There's Acts 11 and Acts 13. This is the commissioning of Paul and Barnabas at Antioch, where they're first called Christians, and then some of Barnabas' work. The Holy Gospel, I should check again. I think it's Mark 6. which is commissioning of the apostles, if I'm not forgetting, Mark 6, 7 through 13. I just don't want to be making up stories. And I think that could be an interesting reading because you will get with Barnabas. He is called an apostle at one point, but not an apostle in the same way that the others were. But that is, yeah, the sending out of the apostles. He calls them out, the 12, and sends them out. And we do recognize in that the apostles there stand for the church, that Christ likewise sends out the church. We wouldn't say that the church shouldn't go into the world today still because they're not the 12 apostles. And so, this could be talking about mission as well, like not like mission statement, but church missions, taking the gospel out.
We're apostolic in the sense that we stand in the apostolic testimony, but we're also sent out apostolic
Yeah.
that way.
But I think what I would really, and maybe you can react to this, Michael. What I would really encourage you to do if you were transferring this and preaching on it is tell Barnabas' story, talk about him as an encourager, because he encourages in two big ways. You get in the sending of Paul and Barnabas, Paul in part is being trusted and is being commissioned because Barnabas gave him a chance. They're very skeptical of Paul. He had been persecuting, he had been killing Christians. And Barnabas recognizes God's call to Paul, even though it seems hard to believe. And Barnabas also recognized Paul's gifts for the task that God had assigned to him. And so without Barnabas, we maybe don't get St. Paul as we know him in the scriptures. I see you got the icon up there that we talked about last episode. Nice. At the very end of the last episode, we discussed that. But this is a good chance to talk about all the stuff in the church that happens that wouldn't happen without lots of people working together. And I think, Barnabas is a wonderful example of that. And then John Mark, who likely author of Mark's Gospel, is going to go out on a mission trip with Paul. We think John Mark is Barnabas' cousin, and Mark gets homesick. He's a young guy, and he ends up going home, and Paul is disappointed in this. Paul's like, we have work to do. This is church work. This is serious work. What's going on? Well, later John Mark wants to go again, and Paul also wants to travel with Barnabas again. And so Paul's reached out to Barnabas, how about we do another missionary journey? And Barnabas says, okay, I'm open to that, but let's take John Mark. And Paul goes, what happened last time? And this doesn't seem to be as nasty of a disagreement as someone might have imagined it to be. But Barnabas really thinks that John Mark should, he recognizes John Mark has gifts just as he did with Paul. Paul is going to go his way then, and we'll get Silas and Luke and others who get mentioned. And Timothy, Barnabas, and John Mark will go that way. We think Barnabas then ends up, I want to say Cyprus again, eventually martyred. And then John Mark does pop up again later in Paul's letters, and Paul commends John Mark, which means Barnabas was right. And John Mark grew into his church work. Maybe that means Barnabas is dead at that point as well. But in both of these cases, Barnabas recognized in people the gifts that God had given them and the calling. And he also showed grace. He showed mercy. And he sought to build up the body of Christ. He encouraged those to whom he took the gospel to. And so I think Barnabas is a wonderful example of a churchman also. We only have a couple minutes, Michael, but I'll throw it to you. Any thoughts, reactions you have on that? And maybe we can just close with, you're at home by yourself. Your church isn't transferring this day, which is absolutely fine. I'm not transferring this day this year. What can you do at home?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of resources there for like church history, like what happened to Barnabas, right? And you don't have to have I got books on the saints and stuff like that. But we have this thing called the internet, right? And so you can easily just go through the history of who Barnabas is. It is kind of fun to see. This is, perhaps he went here, perhaps he went there. Like Mark's another one where like, did he go to
Karl Marx? Oh, John Mark.
Did he go to India? There's a lot of thought that he went to Central Africa. Switching to Mark for a second. That brings in ideas that probably aren't in the foreground of your sort of limited understanding of the early church, right? And so it's fun there. It gets you to think about the global church, gets you to think about your position in the global church, and You can be an encourager, right? Like that really matters, right?
And you can be that, as the confession said, in your calling,
Yep.
as a mother, as a father, as a son, as a daughter. Maybe you're a son or a daughter and your parents are getting older and they need the encouragement. Grandparent, co-worker, the example of encouragement isn't one that is only useful if you're a missionary and apostle. This is something that all of us have areas of our life in which this can be applied. Sorry for
And I
interrupting,
think
Michael.
we should maybe have an episode one day on the gifts of the Spirit. Like immediately we go to tongues, miracles,
We're going to have to get some of those before we can talk
stuff
about
like
them
that.
all.
But if you notice, many of them
Is sarcasm one of
are
them?
many of them are pretty ordinary.
Yep. Yeah.
And as I'll speak for all pastors here, I don't need another person who is on fire for Jesus who wants to get up and speak. You know what I need? I need generosity. I need encouragement. I need some of these gifts
Brotherliness.
I need some of these things, right? Like we think about this a lot, like what happens in the narthex?
Yep.
What happens
And that matters a lot
before-
more than people realize. Yeah.
before and after the church. And it can be hard because you don't want to manipulate this. But man, when you see that happening, when different people who don't know each other are just talking about the latest baseball game or what's happening in the community or gas prices or whatever, that matters,
Yeah.
right? That matters. And I don't know how many times I saw my father do this too. Like, okay, there's some new in the church and maybe a little bit shy. And I did this and I saw him do this. He would go over to somebody who was a solid member who was maybe personal, like, can you go say hi to that person?
Yep. Yep.
Like, I want you to go sit next to that person at the potluck or in the pew or whatever. Introduce yourself to that person. And so that was a behind the scenes subtle way of doing these things. Those things matter so much more than somebody who is just loud and proud about Jesus.
And they help encourage those who are serving in the office of the ministry. Barnabas was in the office of ministry, but he was also building up and encouraging those who were serving in the office. And those are the types of things, as you said, Michael, that do help your pastor and do help your church in ways that go beyond what you know. But also, again, your kid does not want to go to school in the morning and he is rude and his Pop-Tart wasn't hot enough and whatever else. Well, you get a chance to be a Barnabas in your vocation as father or mother there. I think Barnabas is a fun one because there is just so many ways it can be applied in our vocations. We're going to have to wind it down. I have to go to my very important meeting that I'm very excited for, that I in no way think is unnecessary and will be a waste of my time. You got to encourage me now, Michael.
Just get it done.
Okay. Thank you. You're my Barnabas. And but hopefully this gives you a taste of what is a minor festival, how can you make use of it. The last thing I'll close up with, if you're a layperson at home, if you go to the front of your hymnal, and the Lutheran Service Book has this as well for Missouri Synod, but if you're a Wisconsin Synod, a Wells Lutheran, if you go to Roman numeral 26, there's lectionary minor festivals. The readings are listed there. Everything's right there. Maybe for your devotion that day, you go through those readings, and then as Michael said, you Google something, find a nice website on Barnabas, and learn a little bit about our brother who we will see in the When All Things Are Made New.
One more resource, if you want to take the next step, the Treasury of Daily
Yep,
Prayer out of Concordia Publishing House will give you the Old Testament days, one for Sarah, one for Abraham, and so on, but also some of these ones from church history, including Lutheran church history, and they'll give you a prayer for that, but also like a paragraph, sometimes two, on the quick history of that person, right? And so if you want to take the next step, that's a good book, and that's also, well, it's daily prayer too.
Yeah, it's
so
a wonderful
that's
resource in a lot of ways.
So.
Well, we'll go ahead and we will get ready to leave off there, but we do thank you for tagging along. Again, there is great freedom in what you choose to observe regarding minor festivals, commemoration of the saints, etc. But sometimes it's in those areas where there is freedom where we can also find the most joy. Barnabas was a bringer of joy. And I think at the end of the day, as someone who gave his life for the gospel, as someone who committed his life to fellow Christians to build them up, what he would want us to do is all together to join in that freedom and in grace. to let the bird fly. My Tigers have won 3 games in a row, Michael.
Yeah, they're still
We're
terrible.
probably going to the World Series. We're only 13 games under 500 now, but
Do you think
we had 15 starters hurt.
Do you think Martin Luther would have approved of this? Like, no or yes?
Well, I think next time I'm saying something you think is
Or yes.
is not act, you should do the no thing with him.
Okay, so this is no.
That'll be our cue to our
This
listeners.
is no. And this is yes.
All right, I have to go to a meeting. I'm going to wind this down. You have to turn off the recording, Michael. Michael's in charge for our listeners. He's in charge of the button. Let's see you press the button. They can
Right
see you do
now?
your job. And